Good day. Thank you for the chance to share with you some of the findings in research that we conducted to track the globalization period and the prospects for continued development in the post-COVID era. This presentation draws on a paper that I co-wrote with R.C. Balisacan, Jeffrey Ducanes, Clarissa David, and Sheena Valenzuela. And that paper was submitted to DOST as part of their foresight activities to try and look at the development prospects for the country as the country faces various trends, both hitting the region and internationally, notably in terms of the Fourth Industrial Revolution and the post-pandemic recovery landscape. Without further ado, I will talk about some of the ideas outlined in this paper. And I took the liberty of focusing on a few items that I thought would be most relevant to the Department of Social Welfare and Development. For those of you interested in the full paper, it's publicly available and I can send you the link. So the first section of my presentation will focus on the different industrial revolutions, just to set the stage for the discussion. The second will focus on global megatrends, including many of the things that we observe as far as digitalization, the emergence of connectivity in social media, and many other things that are potentially affecting our country and, of course, different other countries across the world. A third section looks at the unequalizing trends. So the first section on global megatrends include a discussion of potential opportunities for the country. The third section, talking about unequalizing trends, presents some of the concerns as far as the potential impact of these trends on both poverty, inequality in the country. And then a final section looks at the potential policy directions for science and technology for inclusion, essentially to try and address the unequalizing trends that we are seeing. So let me begin by first describing the different industrial revolutions that have taken place. This sets the stage for the entire presentation and the paper that we wrote. First, let me talk about the first industrial revolution, which took place from 1760 to 1840. It was propelled by the invention of the steam engine, in turn leading to the emergence of mechanization of production processes. It improved transportation, banking, and communications, and it increased manufactured commodities. It boosted mechanization, which then paved the way for the second industrial revolution. That took place around 1870 to 1914, and the second industrial revolution utilized fossil fuels to produce electricity that led to the birth of mass production and electric communications such as telegraphs and telephones. The third industrial revolution in turn signified the start of the information age that occurred during the 1950s up to the 1970s. The automation of manufacturing was made possible using digital electronics, essentially computers, mobile phones, and information technology. And this is the internet. The fourth industrial revolution, which is the one that many experts see will be or has actually started to evolve already and impact on many countries across the world, that one fuses the physical, digital, and biological domains through technology, embedding it not only within societies, but also within the human body. The fourth industrial revolution is characterized by breakthroughs in various spheres, such as artificial intelligence. I'm sure you are familiar with ChatGPT, BARD, and other examples of artificial intelligence that has taken a lot of media attention lately. Nanotechnology is another area for development in the fourth IR, biotechnology, 3D printing, and Internet of Things. So just to give you a sense of what some of the global megatrends are, And it also gives you a sense of the different industrial revolutions that have taken shape in the past few decades. The flow of goods and services and finance as a percentage of GDP is represented by this figure. And we can see that between 1980 and pretty much close to the present, we have had a massive increase in the flow of goods and services and finance across the world as a share of GDP. And this has been volatile in certain periods. And certainly there are potential changes in some of the flows. For instance, in this case, the recent volatility as far as the global economic situation, and certainly impacted by the pandemic, may have affected some of these flows. But in certain cases, the flows are quite robust and continue to sort of increase. Here is another example of some of these global megatrends: cross-border bandwidth growth. This is essentially signaling the amount of information and the speed by which information and data can be transmitted both within countries and across borders. And we can see that there has been a geometric increase in cross-border bandwidth flows. This is a signal of the amount of integration across economies, societies, and in fact, the connectivity of people across borders and even within borders. Now, part of those flows are, of course, facilitated by the many digital platforms interconnecting both people and firms. As for people, you have many well-known examples such as Facebook, YouTube, TikTok, and the like, Twitter. And then we also have those platforms that interconnect firms, as we know. And these types of platforms allow for a greater and speedier exchange of ideas, exchange of information, data, and in fact facilitates commerce across and within countries. I just want to show you a few examples as far as the Philippines is concerned. These are sort of figures from the pandemic, which may have ramped up the digitalization trends affecting the country. Alibaba Southeast Asia arm, Lazada, for instance, very much present in the Philippines, was reputed to reach 130 million consumers. By now, it's probably a lot larger. This was reported in 2021. As you know, also the use of digital currency, GCash, is one example. PayMaya is another. These types of transactions are seen as contactless and allow for easier commerce, even under restrictions such as lockdowns. And so they were quite convenient and easily helped facilitate the continued functioning of our economy, even during the pandemic. And so it's unsurprising that they started to grow very, very aggressively during that period. And it appears that even as the pandemic appears to be in our rear view mirrors at this point, these many innovations have appeared to be here to stay. And they continue to be used by people for a variety of reasons, including their efficiency and ease of use. Here's another example. As you know, the lockdowns necessitated a different conception of logistics, and many of the firms, particularly in the services industry, were able to continue to function because of delivery services that quickly got organized and allowed for the connectivity between the demand, basically the people, Filipinos, who will be demanding for those services, and the service providers, despite the restrictions in travel and mobility. So here, based on a recent report by Grab, it shows that the growth has been continuous, even though the pandemic appears to be less of a major challenge for many countries at this point, and many countries like the Philippines have begun to open up. These types of platforms continue to grow in terms of the amount of activity that they can host, and certainly the commerce that they can facilitate. And many firms, merchants, basically say that that the delivery platforms are a must-have for their businesses to survive, not just during the pandemic, but in today's world, and it continues to be a very viable platform for continued commerce. And just to give you an example of some of the major products being offered in these platforms, the well-known Halo Halo experienced an 80% increase in orders compared to last year. This is a 2022 report. So there's very much a lot of products being essentially traded due to the platforms that have been put in place. And just to signal the important issue of inclusion, not everyone is able to access Grab. Alam naman po natin may fee po yung Grab, no? And so for those of you who are familiar with the Viber chats and Viber groups being set up near subdivisions and near basically providers, small and medium scale enterprises that can provide products to these major subdivisions and continue to supply these products, and basically food is a big set of products there. The Viber and other platforms for communication, and of course Facebook, became a means for supporting these types of businesses too. So they allow for that connectivity even with the mobility restrictions, and they have become a lifeline. It's sort of like an online mall for both more sophisticated upscale products and maybe even simpler products, such as the local products being provided in small subdivisions, in small settlements. All of those things allowed for the country to continue to function, for the economy to continue to keep on operating even under the lockdowns and the mobility restrictions, and of course trying to overcome the chilling effect of the pandemic itself. And they have basically allowed for many firms to continue to survive and operate, right? But that has not been the case for many other firms that were unable to adapt, and quickly led to many millions of workers losing their jobs, and obviously the deep contraction that we saw in the past 2 or 3 years of the pandemic. So there have been unequalizing trends also, as some sectors in the Philippines were able to adapt to the pandemic and continue to compete, while other sectors were unable to do this, and therefore resulting in worse development outcomes. So I'm just going to show you a few slides that were present during the 2020-2021 period, which was the worst of the pandemic. If you recall, ito po yung panahon na konti pa lang po yung vaccination, and we experienced several surges which forced the country into lockdowns as a last resort. And of course, kung nag-lockdown po yung ekonomiya, masama po yung epekto po niyan sa marami pong business, small and medium scale enterprises. And of course, this is what part of what explains the major contraction that took place, economic contraction that took place during that time. So here are some slides. Unemployed Filipinos increase, and this was during 2021. Of course, some of the bigger contractions already took place as early as 2020. There were millions of Filipinos that fell into poverty, and despite our best efforts to provide social protection for them and social safety nets, these were just not enough for the types of demand and need that emerged during this period. Of course, typical lifeline for the Philippines during crises is the remittances that tend to be counter-cyclical. Ano po ibig sabihin ito? It means that when the country has a crisis, this is usually the period when mas malaki po yung remittances ng ating mga OFW. So kumukontra po siya sa crisis. Pero the pandemic tends to sort of raise questions about that countercyclical model, which has saved us in past crises, because in this case, the pandemic was affecting the entire world. No, pati po yung mga bansa na kung saan nandun yung mga OFW natin, apektuhan din po sila. And in fact, many of our OFWs were sent home and were basically part of the job contractions that took place during that period. So that part of our economic model that appeared to be a strength in the past was maybe still part of our resilience, but not necessarily as strong as before. And then, of course, many Filipinos experienced income cuts, and this is, of course, to be expected when millions of Filipinos lose their jobs, and many small and medium-scale enterprises also start to close up. And the Philippines also has one of those dubious distinctions of being among a few countries that were whose education systems and schools were in lockdown for the longest period of time. In fact, I understand that some analysts claim that the Philippines actually had the longest school lockdowns in the region, if not the world. And this is probably less surprising because the country also was forced into lockdown much, much more often, it seems, compared to its ASEAN neighbors. Now, the interesting thing here is that even as the country appears to, many Filipinos in the country appear to be suffering, there appears to be a sector or a few sectors in the country that were able to adapt well to the crisis. And in fact, there was an observation during one of the crisis years, at least 2021, that the tycoons, the richest in the country, were in fact making more money, and their wealth was actually increasing even as the economy was contracting. This is not surprising, actually, because the way that crises typically affect countries, there could be unequalizing trends built into the crisis adaptation itself. And the general rule is that those with more assets and more wealth tend to be able to better adapt to crisis, and those with less assets and less wealth, less education and less health access, these are the Filipinos tend to pay the higher price during a crisis. So I think there's much food for thought as far as the social inequality among Filipinos, which became more visible as the coronavirus pandemic in the Philippines quickly shifted from being just a health crisis into an economic recession. In July 2020, adult unemployment in the Philippines rose to 45.5% from 17.1% in December 2019, which is equivalent to 27.3 million unemployed Filipinos. So you can imagine the number of families that were severely affected by the crisis based on the job losses alone. While skilled workers were able to continue their employment through a work-from-home setup, less skilled workers, especially those that perform manual labor, and many of the workers in the so-called informal sector, were the most exposed to the infection risk. They had no choice but to go out and earn a living, basically no work, no pay, and yet they were being asked to actually stay at home and comply with the lockdown. So this was part of the realization during that pandemic that not just in the Philippines, but as far as I know, in other ASEAN economies that had to struggle with the social protection systems and safety nets that were needed in order to fully implement the types of counter-pandemic responses that were being put in place then. The other impact of the pandemic is much more subtle but no less debilitating, is the effect on education. To contain the virus, face-to-face interactions were prohibited, prompting schools to move their classes online, but not without encountering challenges on the supply side. This includes the training of teachers, teaching equipment, materials, and the demand side, computers, mobile phones, and internet connection for students to access online classes. And according to the National ICT Household Survey in 2019, only 17.7% of households nationwide had their own internet access at home, and 24% have communal cell phones, but only 2 out of 10 have communal computers. So kulang po talaga yung mga device para dun sa mga mas mahirap, mas low income na mga bata. And so therefore, if you can imagine those kids from relatively better off families, they will be able to continue to access education and probably maintain at least some modicum of quality in the educational instruction. But for the poor and low income families living in very, very tight quarters, sometimes sort of jammed into small rooms, and obviously not the best learning conditions. These are also the families with less access to the types of devices needed for successful, high quality online education. And while those with assets can innovate, experts fear the crisis is likely to exacerbate what is called the Matthew effect, a deepening inequality in access to education and quality of learning across the digital divide. So the Matthew effect is something that certainly appeared to be visible in the Philippines, and probably something that will linger in the meantime that we are trying to recover from the pandemic. So I think the image that I would like to show you for the pandemic situation is an image of adaptability, but also of inequality. So some Filipinos are able to adapt, and those typically are the ones that are wealthier and have more assets, while many Filipinos are less able to adapt. And that situation opens up even more debilitating effect on their development prospects. So poverty is actually dragging their ability to continue to adapt and include themselves in the continued functioning of our economy, and also the continued investments in education and health. The paper that we wrote also flagged another disturbing trend, which was the spread of the infodemic, particularly during the crisis. To build a more resilient and cohesive society, the education system could also be underpinned by more inclusive access to key technologies, notably internet connectivity, and the appropriate education and training for children and young people against disinformation, which has become a bane during the pandemic. In fact, the United Nations released a statement that an overabundance of information, both online and offline, includes deliberate attempts to disseminate wrong information, to undermine the public health response, and advance alternative agendas of groups or individuals. Mis- and disinformation can be harmful to people's physical and mental health, increase stigmatization, threaten precious health gains, and lead to poor observance of public health measures, thus reducing their effectiveness and endangering countries' ability to stop the pandemic. So, of course, we know that mis- and disinformation existed in the Philippines even before the COVID-19 pandemic, but it goes to show that the existence of this trend has a very debilitating effect, particularly during a crisis, because that's precisely the situation when you need a lot of trust in information, when you need a lot of social cohesion, the ability to work together, yung magkaisa-isa po. So misinformation and disinformation has that very debilitating effect of weakening trust, including weakening trust in public health measures, and then also weakening social cohesion to the extent that it breeds divides, it polarizes societies. So the other aspect I wanted to tackle, another emerging trend, which may actually have some unequalizing effects as well, relates to automation and jobs. Even prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, a growing number of analysts and policymakers began to recognize the emergence of the fourth industrial revolution, something which I mentioned earlier, comprised of trends in the adoption of new technologies, fueling automation, harnessing massive amounts of data for analysis, and interlinking vast numbers of people, economies, and systems, underpinning an Internet of Things. So that's essentially the gamut of fourth industrial revolution. Automation is likely to have received a dramatic boost from COVID-19 for various reasons also. And we believe actually that the mobility restrictions, the fact that the labor supply becomes uncertain because of the pandemic impact, and many other trends that may be exacerbated by the pandemic, including, of course, the unpredictability of how the economy will begin to open up again, puts a lot of emphasis on other forms of technology adaptability, which includes automation. And so it is less surprising that experts claim that the pandemic may have accelerated some of these trends, including automation itself. And even prior to COVID-19, analysts were already predicting that over 18 million jobs in the Philippines could be automated, raising the challenges of strengthening education, reskilling for better jobs, matching, boosting innovation and ample social protection and training mechanisms during the adjustment period. So it basically raises the issue of strengthening the social protection system and strengthening the social safety net, as automation may actually displace many Filipino workers, and it may take time before they are able to adapt into other sectors in order to find productive employment. Meanwhile, analysts forecast millions of new high-quality jobs created also as part of the fourth industrial revolution. So this is the promising part of it. And the Philippines is well placed to move up the quality ladder from BPOs to corner many of these jobs, including what some have called big data analytics, big data jobs. Of course, klaro naman po na these types of jobs require very high skills, and not everyone, certainly not all of our workers will be able to quickly acquire those skills and transition to these new jobs. First, those jobs are not going to be as numerous, and there's going to be a lot of skill investment necessary. So this is a cause for concern, as the introduction of technology and the waves of technology affecting different countries will likely create displacement effects on the employment of many workers, including, in this case, Filipinos. As part of the impacts of the pandemic, the paper also emphasizing the needed recovery from the increase in debt to GDP. So the debt to GDP spike that took place, it was, I believe, if we rounded off, something in the order of increasing the debt to GDP ratio from about 30% to over 60% of GDP. And according to the Department of Finance, the agency has already secured a total of 9.914 billion as of September 28, 2020. So even in the first year of the crisis, our Department of Finance turned to debt in order to finance, the counter pandemic responses that we had to put in place during that pandemic period. In one way, this is the reason why you actually maintain those buffers on debt, that you can precisely draw on this type of financing when things go bad, and certainly when the economy is not doing so well. And of course, it behooves all of us and our government to try and maximize the effect of this counter-cyclical push financed by debt, and to minimize the leakages in such a counter-cyclical policy, so that we don't end up with high debt but also mediocre economic recovery. And although the loans can help fund the government's effort to respond effectively to COVID-19, such as buying more health equipment, supporting struggling businesses, and providing cash relief to counter the negative effects of COVID-19, the reality is that future generations will have to shoulder this liability, and economic growth must continue to outpace debt growth in order for the latter to be sustainable. So this is our hope, actually, for 2023, moving forward, that the growth of the country will rebound and will hit what was previously a very robust trajectory of growth that the country had before the pandemic. And then we will begin to grow faster than the debt growth and slow down the debt to GDP ratio once again. The challenge, of course, is that during the pandemic itself, our economy contracted in a very big way, very dramatically, in fact, compared to other ASEAN neighbors. And the analysis of many experts, including those in the World Bank, suggested that the tough response, the lockdowns, has imposed a big cost on the economy without necessarily delivering a commensurate benefit in terms of containing the disease. So it appeared that every time we were unable to control the surge in cases of COVID-19, we were pushed back into lockdown, and the lockdown cost us, in a very dear way, contracting the economy. And the challenge, therefore, for many countries, some of which did a lot better than the Philippines, was to try and flatten the curve, to try and control the spread of the disease through test, trace, and treat strategies that enabled these countries to slow down and mitigate the spread of the disease while their economies continued to function, and while they did not need to resort to more draconian mobility restrictions. And unfortunately for the Philippines, our test, trace, and treat strategy was not really, experts believed it was not really as, as effective as other countries. And so therefore, we always got pushed back into the last resort, which is lockdowns. And it is, I think, a key lesson from the pandemic for us all to realize that lockdowns are never the solution to a pandemic. They are essentially the last resort. And of course, the real solution was to roll out successfully a vaccination campaign. But in anticipation of that, in case the vaccines are not yet available, then flattening the curve, delaying the spread of the disease, managing the spread of the virus through test, trace, and treat strategies, while the economy continues to function in ways that allow for many millions of families to continue to earn a living. This is really the best way to respond to a pandemic. So I'm going to skip this part and sort of go into the science and technology recommendations that we put together in the paper and that were submitted to DOST. Some of which relate to science and technology, but many of which relate to investments in human capital, which I would gather is very, very cogent for the work of the Department of Social Welfare and Development. So here, I just want to point out that the Fourth Industrial Revolution presents both the challenges of displacement of workers from jobs with routinary functions and to produce high-skilled workers for the new jobs that the technological revolution created. Experts projected that by 2022, about 10 million jobs will be generated in data science and big data analytics in the country, making the Philippines a big player in the field. So this is something that we are looking forward to as a future job-generating area after the business process outsourcing area for job growth. This type of highly skilled jobs would entail a shift from being a business process outsourcing hub to a big data processing hub. So this is essentially the plan as advanced by the BPO sector and the big data analytics sector. Therefore, to equip young people with the necessary skills and competencies for this shift, an investment in STEM education is imperative, not only to boost productive inputs, but also as a means to temper the inequality pressures brought about by the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So some countries have actually talked about educational investments in a different way from redistribution. Redistribution is, of course, when you grow the pie and then you start to subdivide what amount of the pie you actually end up getting. That is to be differentiated from the concept of pre-distribution. Yung pre-distribution po, ito po yung mostly investments in human capital that allow for greater inclusion, that allow for many more young people to participate in growing the pie and actually taking their piece of the pie after this is produced. So rather than redistributing the pie after it has been produced in a non-exclusive way, pre-distribution thinks about equipping more young people so that they are actually part of growing that pie and already part of benefiting from that growth. So this may necessitate the transformation of the role of the government from providing remedial compensatory policies. Ito po yung policies na meron ng crisis, meron ng mga poverty, meron ng inequality, tapos tutulungan mo sila, basically palliative. And there could be a shift from that type of approach to a more proactive policy strategy of social investment in the human capital of the people, including of disadvantaged groups, ultimately resulting in a form of pre-distribution, since education could be the key investment for inequality reduction, both globally and in the Philippines. So this is really the difference between redistribution and pre-distribution. Of course, education is just one aspect. The other aspect we need to monitor is health. And we are just coming out of a pandemic, so there is a realization that we cannot simply go back to the old normal of poor health access, which many observe is actually part of the reason why parts of the country they were not able to weather the pandemic that well, because even as the pandemic affected the country, and before that, there were already many millions of Filipinos that did not really have strong access to healthcare. So when the pandemic hit and you had this pre-existing condition, it was less surprising that many Filipinos were unable to cope with the pandemic repercussions. And issues here include insufficient and non-inclusive healthcare and social protection, combined with a growing level of inequality that in part reflected itself in densely populated urban slums, vulnerable to contagion, as well as easily impacted heavily by quarantines and lockdowns. So these conditions, which many of our poorest and low-income people found themselves in, actually made it so that they would pay the highest price during the pandemic. They were most vulnerable. They had no work, no pay conditions. They were in cramped living areas. They were in urban slums where essentially their ability to adapt to many of the restrictions, many of the pandemic responses was actually much weaker compared to the other places with more assets, more wealth, more connectivity. So in fact, this is food for thought for the country to start and rethink the situation, the landscape in the country, now that we have seen what happens when a pandemic hits an already existing vulnerable situation in the country. The case of the Philippines highlighted how the deep divides between the healthcare haves and have-nots and the technology haves and have-nots made the crisis trade-offs noted earlier even more acute. Moving forward, among the key areas for policy focus under the new normal, strengthening and building a more crisis-resilient and inclusive healthcare system is probably the most critical investment from both medium-term and long-term perspectives. So I just want to point out quickly, since I've gone on for quite a while now, another aspect that we recommended in that paper, which was to treat the internet and internet access as a potential public good. Primarily, the thinking here is that those with strong connectivity are able to adapt the most successfully during the pandemic, but also most likely are going to be included in the waves of technology, that will affect the Philippines moving forward in the post-pandemic landscape, which is called the Fourth Industrial Revolution. So the other aspect of this has to do with digitalization and technology transfer and access. I have the pleasure of sharing that digitalization is a big part of our Philippine development plan for 2023 to 2028. And having the opportunity to contribute to that plan, I know that the Marcos administration very much emphasized digitalization as part of our country's investment to try and continue to compete as the Fourth Industrial Revolution evolves and affects the country, but also as a measure for better governance and inclusion in markets and economic trends that now emphasize the importance of connectivity in the digital age. So here, it's expected that the COVID-19 pandemic sped up the adoption and use of digital technology. And I was showing you all those trends earlier as far as Facebook, TikTok, Grab, Lazada, and others in terms of integrating all these digital platforms into the daily lives of many Filipinos. And it appears that there will also be a potential unequalizing effect of this trend if not everyone is successfully accessing or included in the rise of these digital platforms. And certainly, if you have firms that are able to thrive in these platforms, and then many firms that are unable to thrive and were suffering during the lockdown, then you can see the unequalizing effect and the difference between those firms that adopt and those firms that are unable to adapt. Finally, I just want to end with this slide. I think it's a message that I want to convey to our good colleagues in Department of Social Welfare and Development, that in fact redistribution, so this is typically seen by economists as the means by which we take from the economic pie and then redistribute it once that economic pie, that wealth is created, right? So this takes place in terms of taxation, so taking that part of the pie and then using those resources to channel goods and services back to the most vulnerable. So you are redistributing the wealth created through taxing, by actually taxing and then plowing it back to the poor and vulnerable communities, right? That's typically seen as redistribution. In fact, in some ways, a cash transfer is a redistributive policy. But the way that you channel resources to poor and low income communities and disadvantaged sectors can be seen also as strategic and linked to this notion of redistribution. And here the quote from Professor Ricardo Hausmann, I think he hit it on the head as far as this idea of redistribution versus inclusion. Redistribution is palliative, meaning that the generation of the pie is actually not very inclusive and could be very, very exclusive in a country. And that could be the case when many people do not have the skills, do not have the education, are unable to access healthcare. And so therefore there is an unequalizing aspect to the growth of the economy. And so therefore it's unsurprising in those situations that the pie is actually not distributed well. But redistributing that pie once it's generated is quite palliative. And in fact, Professor Hausmann emphasized this, that inclusion is the real cure to this type of inequality. That what you want to do is to invest in human capital, make sure there's strong education and health, so that in the generation of the pie itself, there are more people engaged in the economy and more people who are immediately included in the productivity that needs to take place in order to continue to develop the country. So I will leave it here. I thank you for lending me your ears and listening to this presentation. If we have a chance for an exchange of ideas, comments, and questions, I would be happy to engage in this. Thank you so much to the DSWD for the kind invitation to contribute to today's discussions.